My brain felt what my heart refused to see. I always considered myself a happy wife. 40 years of marriage, 3 wonderful children, a home in a quiet Pennsylvania neighborhood. But sometimes the strongest families harbor the darkest secrets, and sometimes it takes a brain injury to see the truth about the person you share your bed with. My name is Barbara Collins. I'm 61 years old, and what I'm about to tell you changed everything I thought I knew about love and lies. It all started in the spring of 2020, when the world stopped because of the pandemic. Our daughter Sarah worked as a nurse at a Philadelphia hospital and was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. 12-hour shifts in the COVID ward, and at home, 2 children on spring break with no one to watch them. Her husband Michael was trying to juggle remote programming work with watching 7-year-old Jake and 5-year-old Emma, but it was impossible. When Sarah called me in tears asking for help, I packed my suitcase without hesitation. My husband Robert, a retired fire captain, took my decision calmly. We'd been married for 35 years, and he knew family always came first for me. Robert was a reliable husband and caring father. In his final years before retirement, he'd become somewhat thoughtful and withdrawn. But I attributed this to fatigue from 30 years of service with the fire department. He'd earned a peaceful retirement. I planned to stay in Philadelphia for a couple of weeks, but the pandemic dragged on. Every time I was ready to return home, something got in the way. Either schools extended remote learning, or Sarah had another quarantine after contact with infected patients. The children got used to me, and I to them. For the first time in years, I felt truly needed. Robert called 2 or 3 times a week. He'd share news from town, ask about the grandchildren, show interest in what I was doing. He missed me, but understood the importance of my help to our daughter. He said that when everything was over, we'd take ourselves a nice vacation. Maybe go to Florida, which we'd always dreamed about. The last time we spoke was March 20th, 2021. Robert mentioned he was feeling a bit under the weather, but nothing serious. He planned to rest over the weekend and be fine by Monday. We discussed my plans to return home by Easter. Quarantine restrictions were beginning to ease. On the evening of March 23rd, Robert himself called me. His voice was tired, raspy. He delivered terrible news. His twin brother Richard had died from COVID. Robert told me that Richard had gotten sick a week ago but was hiding it, not wanting to worry anyone. He lived alone in a rented apartment, worked construction as a handyman. When he felt really bad, he called Robert. Robert rushed over, but it was too late. Richard died on the way to the hospital. Robert blamed himself. He said he should have visited his brother more often, that he should have insisted on hospitalization earlier. He and Richard had always been close, despite their different life paths. Robert built a career and family, while Richard spent his whole life getting by on odd jobs, never able to settle his personal life. I couldn't come to the funeral because of COVID restrictions on interstate travel. Plus, Sarah had just come down with a high fever. Suspected COVID. Robert said he'd handle everything himself, that he didn't want to risk my health. Our children also couldn't come to say goodbye to their uncle. Our eldest son, David, was serving in the army in Germany. Our youngest, Thomas, was working as a doctor in Los Angeles and couldn't leave his patients during the pandemic. Richard was buried in the town cemetery. Robert called me after the funeral, crying. He said he felt guilty that he couldn't save his only brother, that now he was completely alone in the world. In the following months, Robert called less frequently, He explained that he was having a hard time with the loss, that he was throwing himself into housework to distract himself from grief. His voice became more hoarse. He said he'd caught a mild form of COVID, but was treating himself at home. Didn't want to go to the hospital after everything that happened with his brother. I planned to return home by the beginning of summer 2021. Quarantine restrictions had eased. The children had gone to summer camp. Sarah was managing better. When I returned on June 15th, Robert met me at the doorstep. He'd lost weight, looked exhausted. His voice remained hoarse. He explained that COVID had been hard on him, even though he treated it at home. The doctor said recovery could take months. We hugged on the threshold of our home, and I felt how much I'd missed my husband. The pandemic, his brother's death, my long absence, all these trials made our reunion especially touching. Robert had changed. He became softer, more attentive, more romantic. He said that losing his brother and his own illness had made him reconsider his priorities, that he realized how important it was to treasure every day with the person you love. He bought me flowers for no reason, planned romantic dinners, showed more interest in my hobbies than he had in all the previous years. I joked that COVID had turned him into the perfect husband. The children were happy about the changes in their father. When Sarah came with the grandchildren in July, she was amazed at how actively Dad had started playing with the kids, coming up with entertainment for them. David, who got leave from the army in August, was shocked by how his father had changed. He'd started showing interest in his plans instead of his usual criticism. We began traveling. We went to the ocean, visited national parks, stayed in cozy hotels. Robert received a good fire captain's pension, $4,200 a month, plus excellent health insurance. For the first time in years, we could afford not to economize on pleasures. Robert began talking more about his feelings. He talked about how much he missed me when I was at Sarah's, how he was afraid of getting COVID and dying without seeing me, how Richard's death reminded him of life's fragility. Sometimes he cried, remembering his brother. He'd tell stories about how inseparable they were as children, how Richard always got into trouble and Robert would bail him out, how sorry he was that he couldn't help him that final time. We lived 2 years in this new, improved marriage. I was happier than I'd ever been. I felt like I'd finally gotten the husband I dreamed of. And then came the accident that changed everything. On July 15th, 2023, I was returning from the grocery store when a boy on a bicycle darted into the road. I jerked the steering wheel and crashed into a telephone pole. The child was fine, but I got a concussion and spent 3 days in the hospital. Robert never left my bedside. He read to me aloud, brought home-cooked food, massaged my hands. The doctors said I was recovering quickly, but I needed to take it easy for several weeks. When I returned home, strange things began. I looked at Robert and felt inexplicable anxiety. He looked like my husband, sounded like my husband, but something inside me screamed that this wasn't him. Every time he came close, my body involuntarily tensed. The doctor said this was a normal reaction after a head injury, temporary perceptual disturbance that would pass in a few weeks. But weeks went by, and the feeling only intensified. I began noticing small things in life. Robert held his spoon with the wrong hand. He read the newspaper starting from the last page instead of the first, as always. When I made his favorite meatloaf, he ate it without particular enthusiasm, though this dish had always delighted him before. Robert explained these oddities as consequences of COVID. He said the illness had changed his taste sensations, that many habits had gotten mixed up during my absence. After a month, I consulted a neurologist. Dr. Hansen conducted a series of tests and made a diagnosis: Capgras syndrome, a rare disorder in which a person stops recognizing loved ones, considering them imposters or doubles. But something about this diagnosis troubled me. I recognized Robert perfectly: his face, voice, mannerisms. The problem wasn't that I didn't recognize him. The problem was that every cell of my body was screaming, "This isn't him." Robert reacted to the diagnosis with relief. He promised to be patient, said he loved me no matter what, and was ready to wait for recovery, however long it took. But I could see how he relaxed when he learned that my condition had a medical name. But I noticed how he got nervous when I looked at him too intently, how he flinched if I asked questions about our past. My traumatized brain continued finding inconsistencies. Robert had forgotten passwords to all our accounts. He couldn't find important documents in places where he'd always kept them. He mixed up the names of our neighbors, whom he'd known for 20 years. When I asked him about our first meeting, he told the story correctly, but mixed up details. He said we met in a cafe, though we met at a friend's party. He mentioned that I was wearing a red dress, but I remembered it being blue. Robert quickly agreed with my corrections, explaining that his memory after the illness wasn't working perfectly, that COVID had affected his brain more than he'd thought. In September, Sarah came with the children. At dinner, she told her father about her work, mentioning hospital cases they'd discussed over the phone before his illness. Robert nodded and smiled, but I could see confusion in his eyes. Then, Sarah took out her phone and showed photos of the grandchildren from the previous summer. Robert looked at them with interest, but when our daughter asked if he remembered building a birdhouse with Jake in July 2020, he hesitated. He said many memories from that period had gotten mixed up. After our daughter left, Robert became even more nervous. He checked the door locks several times each evening. He jumped at every sound. When I asked what was bothering him, he said it was consequences of stress from losing his brother. I began studying information about Capgras syndrome. I read medical articles, stories of other people. I learned an amazing thing. Sometimes this disorder could be a protective reaction. The subconscious senses danger or deception before consciousness is ready to acknowledge it. What if my brain was trying to tell me something? In October, I decided to find medical documents about Robert's COVID treatment. I searched the whole house. Not a single hospital paper. No prescriptions, certificates, discharge papers. But in the dresser drawer, I found something that made my heart stop. A prescription for insulin written out to Robert Collins. Date, April 15th, 2021. Almost a month after Richard's death. My husband had never had diabetes. In 35 years of marriage, he'd never injected himself with insulin, never checked his blood sugar, ate sweets without restrictions. But Richard had had type 1 diabetes since childhood. I remembered how he gave himself injections at family holidays, how he always carried a glucose meter, how carefully he treated sweets. I often prepared separate dishes without sugar for him. The prescription was written by Dr. Stevens from our neighborhood clinic, the same doctor who had been monitoring Robert for 20 years and knew perfectly well that he'd never had diabetes. When I asked Robert about this prescription, he was confused. He said COVID had affected his pancreas, that many recovered patients develop diabetes, that Dr. Stevens had prescribed insulin as prevention. But I knew this was a lie. Insulin isn't prescribed for prevention, and they certainly don't write prescriptions for such doses to healthy people. Then I went to the cemetery to visit Richard's grave. I found a modest gray stone with the inscription, Richard Collins, 1958 to 2021. The grave looked neglected, dried flowers, weeds, no signs of recent visits. This surprised me. Robert had grieved so heavily over his brother's death, but hadn't visited his grave once in 2 years. When I asked him about this at home, Robert was embarrassed. He said it was too painful to come to the cemetery, that he preferred to remember his brother alive, but he promised we'd visit the grave together on the anniversary of his death. In November, I went to our neighborhood clinic to see Dr. Stevens. He'd been monitoring Robert for 20 years and agreed to talk with me about my husband's health. The doctor looked through the medical chart and explained that COVID could indeed cause various complications, including diabetes. But when I showed him the insulin prescription, Dr. Stevens frowned. He compared test results and showed me an amazing picture. In March 2020, Robert's sugar level was normal. In April 2021, critically high, like someone with advanced diabetes. The doctor admitted that such sharp changes were extremely rare even after severe COVID. Usually diabetes develops gradually, and here it seemed like the person had been sick for many years already. Dr. Stevens also noted that my husband had seemed different to him during that April visit, more nervous, hurried. Previously, Robert had always been a calm and thorough patient. In December, I decided to check another version. I went to our neighborhood pharmacy where Robert bought medications. Pharmacist Mrs. Johnson had worked there for 15 years and knew all the regular customers well. She was surprised by my visit and readily told me about how often Robert had started coming for insulin, every 2 weeks since April 15th, 2021. The woman wondered how such a healthy person could suddenly develop diabetes. She remembered that previously my husband only bought vitamins and aspirin for headaches, and now he was asking detailed questions about insulin dosages and side effects, as if encountering these medications for the first time. The pharmacist also noted an oddity in behavior. When she habitually began explaining the features of the new insulin to him, as she usually did for people just starting diabetes treatment, Robert confidently stopped her and said he knew everything perfectly well. This seemed unusual to Mrs. Johnson because Robert had always been an inquisitive person. Previously, he would ask about even simple vitamins, read instructions, show interest in ingredients. But here he suddenly showed complete knowledge of a matter he'd supposedly encountered for the first time. The next day, I went to the police station. Sergeant Miller had known our family for many years and agreed to listen to my story. I told him about Capgras syndrome, about the oddities in my husband's behavior, about the insulin prescription for a man who'd never had diabetes. Miller listened attentively, occasionally asking clarifying questions. The sergeant explained that suspicions of identity substitution were a serious matter, but solid evidence was needed. A prescription for medicine that my husband's brother needed was evidence, but insufficient to open a case. He suggested conducting an exhumation of the body buried under Richard's name. DNA examination would show who really lay in that grave. If it turned out to be my real husband, then police would have grounds to arrest the imposter. I thought about this decision for a week. Dig up a body from the grave, conduct an examination, destroy the life we'd built for 2 years. What if I was wrong? What if Capgras syndrome really was making me see ghosts where there were none? But the insulin prescription couldn't be explained by medical error. A person with type 1 diabetes cannot live without insulin for even a day. That meant whoever was buying these medications had been diabetic long before April 2021. In January 2024, I gave consent for the exhumation. The procedure took 2 weeks. Court, permits, medical experts. All this time, I lived with a man who could turn out to be my husband's killer. Richard suspected nothing about the investigation. He continued being the perfect husband. He made me breakfast, massaged my back, planned Christmas gifts for the grandchildren. I looked at him and thought that if my suspicions were confirmed, this caring man had allowed my real husband to die. On December 23, 2023, Detective Harrison called me with the examination results. DNA confirmed. Buried in the grave under the name Richard Collins was Robert Collins. My husband had died 2 years ago, and I'd been living with his brother imposter. That same day, detectives came with an arrest warrant. Richard wasn't even surprised. He sat at the kitchen table where we'd had breakfast every morning for 2 years and calmly confessed everything. He told me he'd come to Robert on March 23rd when Robert felt bad from COVID. Robert had asked his brother to stay, afraid to die alone. Richard had cared for him for several days, but his condition only worsened. When Robert lost consciousness and it became clear he was dying, Richard made a decision that changed everything. He had serious debts to dangerous people. There was no work, no prospects either. But here was an opportunity to get a stable pension, a house, a family. Richard explained that Robert was dying from COVID anyway, that he didn't kill his brother, just took advantage of the situation. He switched their documents, called an ambulance when it was too late, and told everyone that Richard had died. The next 3 months, he studied his brother's life. He read our letters, looked through photographs, memorized family stories. He prepared to become a better version of Robert, more attentive, romantic, caring. And he succeeded. For 2 years, he was the perfect husband I deserved. The children learned the truth from the detective. Sarah sobbed, not believing what had happened. David screamed into the phone that he'd kill that bastard. Thomas was quiet for a long time, then quietly asked how I'd survived it all. Richard was tried for fraud with government benefits and negligent homicide. He got 8 years in prison. At the trial, he asked for forgiveness. He said he'd never planned to cause pain, that he'd sincerely loved our family, that he'd wanted to give us a better version of Robert. Maybe he was telling the truth. Perhaps Richard really did love us, more than my real husband ever had, but he let Robert die. Those critical hours when it was still possible to save a person, Richard spent planning his own future. He chose money over his brother's life. Now I live alone in the house I shared with an imposter for 2 years. My so-called Capgras syndrome passed shortly after the arrest. Because it wasn't an illness at all. My brain was perfectly healthy and correctly sensed danger. The doctor made a misdiagnosis, as sometimes happens, and I almost believed I was going crazy instead of trusting my own intuition. Sometimes, late in the evenings, I think about those 2 years. They were the happiest in my marriage. Richard gave me the attention and love I'd been deprived of with my real husband. But every time these thoughts come to mind, I remember the insulin prescription in the dresser drawer. Proof that the person I loved existed only because of my real husband's death. My Capgras syndrome wasn't a disease, but properly functioning intuition. My brain felt what my heart refused to see. That perfect love can be the most terrible lie.